I think, and I know this is an idea that's come from the Green Movement, localisation, the antithesis of globalisation. I think there's a lot in there that is of interest to socialists, that we would have to sort of wind the clock back a little bit. And that graph that we had earlier on is looking at CO2 emissions since the over the last few centuries and how they've ramped up since the mid-70s. Well, one thing that has ramped up is transportation. Global transportation has ramped up absolutely massively. The question was more specifically on energy, however. But I suppose my point there was that, put it this way, the working class in Britain have been bought off by capitalism for the last century or so, since they got the franchise, since the idea of socialism came around, have been bought off by increased living standards. But the increased living standards have been fairly gentle over a period of time. If your parents had an outside toilet, but you have an inside toilet, and your children have central heating, then over the course of a couple of generations, you're seeing this gradual improvement. So I don't think that we need the third world to suddenly all have a swimming pool in their backyard like some workers have in America, although their houses may now be repossessed. I just don't think that's a very realistic situation. I'm inferring that if your expected mortality age is in the mid-30s or something like that, then you'd be quite glad to be living a few decades more. You're not needing that level of standard of living immediately. You just need to see the planet doing everything it can to equilibrate. Now, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, one of the scenarios that they allow for there is that they're expecting that around the world everybody's going to have the same standard of living of the mature nations, the mature capitalist nations. So that's quite an assumption that they make there as well. But still, in terms of energy production, there are these technologies that are going around. It's hard for them to actually get to a critical mass because the larger you are, particularly with energy and energy efficiency, the larger you are, the more efficient it is, usually. And then that means that the price comes down. And we've heard price, a very good point made by a question earlier on about the price when a barrel of oil hits $100 a barrel, then suddenly all these oil fields that were uneconomic suddenly become economic. In fact, my last point on this, Glenn wants to get in, is that I was reading last week that they're opening coal mines in Britain again. We thought that was a dying industry. With a lot of talk about Bevan boys mentioned this afternoon. Well, they're opening the coal mines again simply because the price of oil has gone up so high that it now makes it economic to start pulling this dirty fuel back out of the ground again. And this is the logic of capitalism. With one hand they're saying, oh, we've got to deal with global warming. But on the other hand they're saying, oh, but that's cheap, I fancy some of that. This is the problem that we have.
I would agree with that. Also, my understanding of the situation at the moment is the big oil companies are doing their absolute best to suppress other forms of energy because it's not really in their interest to have other forms of energy that's going to disrupt their business activities. And I think that goes with that. It's a thing that's gone on for ages anyway, that sort of thing. Also, you talk about Africa is often held up, and rightly so. In sub-Saharan Africa, thousands of children are dying, and I've mentioned that myself, and I find that extremely hard to conceive. I don't know how it's as if, a mother's not likely to breathe any less in Africa with a dying child than she would in this country, yet it seems to be accepted as something of that's just what Africa's like, pretty much as summer, holiday, and spring. But I would say on the issue of poverty, I've just read a bit of research today as I was coming up, funny enough, that equates consumption of goods with happiness, and we plateaued out now. So the amount of things we consume is now being shown actually by research not to make us any happier. So I don't think one can equate the acquisition of more and more things and with happiness. However, of course, it would be quite wrong to say that we expect Africans to be sort of, smiling next to their huts regardless. Of course, one would expect them to have a much better lifestyle. On the subject of food consumption, which you mentioned, I also read today, and this is backed up by research, that the cost to America at the moment is billions of dollars in dealing with Americans spending money on things like liposuction, appetite suppressants, dietary supplements, all these things to try and deal with their weight. The actual cost could pay, on balance, for the food needed for the sub-Saharan Africa. So, leaving aside the fact that we actually throw away 30% of the food we buy and buy 30% more than we need. So we buy 30% more than we need and we throw 30% of it away. Leaving that aside, as I say, the Americans on their liposuction and everything else, if they save that money, they could feed the people that need feeding. The other thing, of course, I made a quick note here is that about this lifestyle thing you kind of allude to, where people all want something better. I read somewhere that you don't need to advertise food to a hungry man, but most of us are sold commodities on the basis of advertising. We're constantly being persuaded that we need things that we actually don't really need. And even now, companies are desperate to get laptops into Africa so they can persuade them they need, various things like Coca-Cola or iPods or whatever it is, because it makes sense to try and sell these people these things. But what I'm saying is we don't really need as much, I don't think, as we can't be led to believe we do.